With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
And welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us on this special edition Friday night version of Tactics, where speech isn't violence, tolerance is not love, and disagreement isn't hate. So the reason that we're having this special broadcast is because the other night we were not able to get on the air because I was doing a guest appearance for Sports Radio 740. So we're really only going to cover the what would have happened the other night on the show had we actually had one. And I'm not going to do a ton of local news. I really want to stay kind of focused on what we missed out on the Democrats' response the other night when it came to the that 7-hour-long climate change forum, the town hall that they had. And I gotta say, even though have by no means bought into this whole man-made climate change thing and that the world's basically going to be a fireball in 12 years, but I have to admit, if you were going to peddle this narrative, you couldn't have picked a better time to do it because it is hot. I was out doing a cookout for some of my students the other day, and it was funny because, and these are all primarily athletes that are used to being hot, used to being out in the sun. I was standing out there manning the grill. They were all up in the shade. I mean, I got to tell you, it is hot. It has been really hot this week. I mean, it is so hot that Florida actually invited the hurricane to come over just to get the rain. It is so hot that Hillary Clinton's heart almost thawed a little bit. It's so hot that Nancy Pelosi had to call her plastic surgeon because her face melted off. I mean, it is hot. But if they were going to pick an opportune time to talk about this, I guess now would be the case. It is the reason that they probably planned. I don't think that it's the reason they scheduled it when they did, but I'm guessing that it was at least part of the luck that came with that. But there was a lot that they discussed, a lot that we need to discuss tonight. But the one that I think was the most important, the figure that kind of led the charge here that I find the most fascinating, was Pete Buttigieg. Now, there was a lot that was said, and I'm going to be honest with you, 9 times out of 10 when these big events come out and I do a segment specifically on that, I know ahead of time I'm going to do a segment on it, I watch the whole thing full context to make sure that I have everything right, that I'm not missing anything, and also so I can pick up on some clips that your media types, your media outlets may not have picked up on, things that I find interesting that maybe someone else missed. I do that quite a bit. This was not one of those times because it was 7 hours long. And it was on a Wednesday, which means I have Bible study and all kinds of other things. I want you to really put this into perspective. This thing was so long that I, a political pundit whose job it is to pay attention to politics, couldn't sit through the whole thing. And I really do think that I don't think that was CNN's plan because, of course, CNN wants viewership. But it's kind of the effect that you have when it comes to YouTube. Now, CNN is obviously on a larger scale because it's a cable news thing, and typically a cable news' audience has a longer attention span than somebody that's going through YouTube. But one thing that you learn being a YouTuber like I am is that there's a certain cutoff point. Everybody has that cutoff point, and it's different for different people. But by and large, if you have a video that is more than about 10 minutes, nobody's going to watch it unless they're a diehard fan. Unless they have already come to you and been convinced that your content is worth 10 minutes of their time, they don't go to you. That span is longer on cable news. Typically anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. That's the reason that they have the 30-minute to an hour blocks on most cable channels, whether you're talking about news or anything else. And if they're a real political geek, they may stick around for a 2 or 3 hour debate or a town hall. But 7 hours? The fact that it was 7 hours probably deterred pretty much everybody. And I'm talking about of all political persuasions, of all levels of interest, because ain't no way ain't no way it's ever going to happen that you have a non-political person, somebody that's not really interested in it, watching 7 hours worth of this stuff. But even the people that eat, breathe, and live politics every single day, I gotta find it hard to believe that any of them sat through 7 hours of this. Even if climate change is their big thing, I still have a hard time believing, and I'm kind of surprised that the candidates even agreed to it. Because this is not going to do much to differentiate them from their political opponents trying to get elected. And like I said, it probably scared off just about any interested voter, so I don't know why they would do this. I will say the one thing that I thought was really interesting about it is I don't understand why they went with like a Reading Rainbow background. You remember Reading Rainbow? It was on PBS when I was a kid. TV's LeVar Burton. I really think LeVar Burton should have been the one doing these interviews, because that background looks just like the one that they had when they used to bring on guests with Reading Rainbow, that sort of Earth from a sky view kind of thing. It was just an odd choice for a background. I get it was because it was the climate change town hall, but I don't know. It made it look kind of cheesy and dorky. But I think the fact that it was set up kind of like Reading Rainbow was appropriate, because let's be honest, that's about the education level of the people that were watching this and buying into what the candidates were saying, probably somewhere around a 4th to 6th grade level, which is kind of where Reading Rainbow was aiming for. So I think that was sort of accidentally appropriate when it comes to that. But I want to get into some of the clips, and what I find fascinating, and I mentioned already that I'm going to go to Pete Buttigieg first. What's most interesting about him is what he said in the climate change town hall was interesting enough, but it gets even more interesting when you flesh out what he was saying. To me, the interviews that he did post debate or post town hall, whatever you want to call it, to me, that was the more interesting of the commentary that he gives on that, where he actually has time to flesh out and explain exactly what it was he was saying. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and go to this. This is Buttigieg appearing the next morning on CNN, sort of explaining and giving some clarification on what he said the night before.
I think that it makes a lot of people feel very helpless. Because yes, we can all do away with our plastic straws, and I haven't drank out of a straw for the past 6 months because I'm so worried about what's happening in the ocean. But people feel helpless when it's something that existential.
Right,
so
and that's
what do you do about that?
That's one of the things. I think the downside to us facing just how colossal of a challenge this is it can feel paralyzing, but we can rise to meet this and be proud of it. That's part of what my climate plan is about. It's not only about all of the things we've got to do technologically and with regulation and so on. It's about summoning the energies of this country to do something unbelievably hard. If you look at the moments when this country rose to a major challenge, overcoming the Great Depression, winning World War II, going to the moon, it required something out of all of us. And I think we could be standing taller. See, right now we're in a mode where I think we're thinking about it mostly through the perspective of guilt, from using a straw to eating a burger. Am I part of the problem? And in a certain way, yes, but the most exciting thing is that we can all be part of the solution.
So, a lot to unpack there. First of all, what Buttigieg is saying, the big takeaway was, well, if you're eating burgers and using plastic straws, you are part of the problem. So he's alienating, about 95% of the American population. just from a sheerly political standpoint, whether I agreed with them or not, whether I thought that it was an actual problem or not an actual problem, whether I agreed with his policies or didn't, from a political perspective, that's about as dumb a move as you can do. To say, you're part of the problem here, and make a statement, anybody that eats burgers or uses plastic straws. That covers a massive, massive swath of the American population, across party lines, across all demographics, across all ages. That hits home for a lot of people and turns them off immediately. That is a massive political no-no for anybody, regardless of what party they were running for or what policy they were pushing, is to alienate people and call them part of the problem in that way. Now, to understand exactly where Buttigieg is coming from, one of the common points that was talked about is the issues that are taking place where people are saying that the cattle are producing methane and literally cow poop. It's a bullcrap argument, because bullcrap is exactly what we're dealing with. That somehow they're producing this massive amount of CO2. Done videos on this on the past. There's nothing to it. First of all, most of the people that talk about this don't know their science at all. And I say this as an ag major from Auburn University, one of the premier land grant institutions in the country, with an ag degree. I wouldn't say that I'm the world's foremost expert on beef production cattle, but I've had several classes on it and have way more experience raised cattle myself than about 99% of the American population. And the idea that this is somehow a environmental hazard is so beyond stupid. They're saying it accounts somewhere for like 14% of all carbon emissions. I'm sorry, it's nowhere even close to that. I mean, first of all, you'd have to completely ignore the fact that cattle predate human beings raising them by a lot. So how do you account for the cattle that existed before man started raising them domestically? And then they get into all these crazy arguments about, well, if we just stopped feeding them, then we could use that same feed, the same resources that we're using for them to feed humans, which is also not true, because when you're talking about the grain that they're fed dent corn, not sweet corn, which, by the way, humans can't digest. And they're also fed a lot of food waste products that humans also can't digest. Orange peels, other kind of refuse, other kind of fruit, potato peels, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of that cattle produce that can't be used for human consumption, but is turned into food by them digesting it and making it nutritious for us. And then you also have to keep in mind that this is especially true in America, because about a third of America's landmass is far too stony or hilly for row cropping. In other words, we can't produce cereal grains or other kinds of crops in a way that would be efficient and actually produce more than it would cost to make it for about a third of America's landmass. So what do we use that land for? Well, a big chunk of it we use for ranching, for animal production, and that produces food on land that would otherwise go completely to waste. So this idea that we can just get rid of all the cattle and then just reappropriate all the feed that we're using for them to other people, I'm sorry, from a logistics standpoint, there's just not an ounce of truth to it. And the straw thing is also fascinating to me, and you have, what's her name, Alison Camerado, I think is how to say it. You've got her saying, I haven't used a plastic straw in 6 months because I'm so worried about what's going on in the ocean. If you'll go back to one of the segments we did, I don't know, about 2 years ago, in a segment called Straw Wars, we go through the stats and show you where, if you're looking at all the statistics, you're looking at all of the plastic in the ocean. Well over 3/4 of it doesn't come from North America at all. Not America, North America and South America, because it's coming from specifically Africa and Asia. Those two continents by themselves are producing well over 3/4 of the plastic in the ocean. Is that a big problem? Sure. But when you're looking at America, which produces roughly 5% of the plastic waste in the ocean overall, despite having a much larger population than a lot of the industrialized countries, when you're looking at that, we only produce about 5% of the plastic overall, and that's everything. That's not just plastic straws. And then you look at the amount that plastic straws actually do contribute, you're looking at, and we did the math, roughly 0.002% of the plastic waste that's in the ocean. So the idea that you not using plastic straws is somehow helping the environment makes no sense, especially if you're one of the people that actually disposes of them properly. If you're not throwing straws into the ocean, then you are not part of the problem that is contributed to by plastic straws winding up in the ocean. It's the same thing that liberals use for guns. They'll say they had a guy just, I don't know, a few weeks ago that they did a news story about where he turned in his AR-15 and they talked about, oh, look at him, he's so brave, he's a gun owner and he's saving lives by turning in his AR-15. Well, if the thing was sitting in his closet and not being used to kill people, then how is it saving lives? That doesn't make any sense. If it's sitting idly by and nobody's going to get a hold of it, nobody that is going to kill people is going to get it and hurt someone with it, and it's properly maintained and kept in a safe space, then how is him turning it in saving anyone? It's the same thing with the straws. As long as you're not throwing it into the ocean and disposing of it properly, your plastic straw is not part of the problem. It's not winding up in the ocean in the first place. It's just patently absurd, some of the mental gymnastics these guys have to go to. And what Buttigeig does talk about there is he says when it comes to things like the Great Depression, or when it comes to things like going to the moon or World War II, we were united behind a common cause, and that's why we were able to do these things that are really difficult. That's the part of the clip that's actually true. But if that is the case, and it is, you have to ask yourself, why is it that Americans are not united on this? Why is it that Americans don't feel like this is something worth rallying around? Well, when it comes to plastic straws and burgers, it's because, as I just explained, the whole thing is built on lies. There is no truth behind it, therefore people don't get on board with the fact that we ought to unite on it. And so there's, you run into that, but we also are not united because we don't necessarily, all of us, believe that it's a real problem or believe that the solutions being proposed would actually work. When it came to the Great Depression, we did all unite behind a common theme, a common idea, and it failed miserably. And that is, of course, the New Deal. When FDR put those proposals together, and he was acting as a contrast to Herbert Hoover, which is hilarious because basically FDR's policies were, let's do what Herbert Hoover did, only more of it. We united behind that policy and coalesced, and it was a massive failure, and that depression lasted for about 10 years. And it's only when we shifted to a war economy that America started pulling itself out and becoming a economic powerhouse again. So that's what's really important to understand, is that, yeah, it's good to be united, but you need to be united around truth. And when you're united around a solution that doesn't work, all you do is wind up making the problem worse because everybody goes along with the bad idea. And so you can look at it from that angle as well. And essentially, this is the reason that a lot of us aren't united behind Pete Buttigieg's vision for what we ought to be doing when it comes to the environment, because his solution is essentially, why don't we deindustrialize? One of the hallmarks of a first world nation, one thing that you can quickly look at and determine whether something is a first world nation or not, is the diet and how much money people are spending on food. Americans are one of the very few countries that enjoys meat at practically every meal. You don't have to do it, obviously. But I'm just saying, if you're comparing countries and looking at ones that are wealthy versus ones that are not wealthy, usually what's a big deal about the wealthy countries, a big indicator of that is, are they eating meat? And then you go one step further, how much are they spending on their food as a whole? And America, by and large, spends less money on food than any other country. And by the way, that has gone down in recent years. And the only reason that it has raised up any, it would actually be a lot lower. It would have lowered even more in the past 20 or 30 years if we weren't eating out at restaurants so much. So we're including service as a part of the cost. And so what we're doing now works. It's economically prosperous, it's efficient, it feeds more hungry people. And driving down that food cost allows us to not only feed more hungry people and grow food more efficiently, but it also allows us a lot of the other luxuries. The left's proposal is to deindustrialize, to move backward, and to essentially take us back to where we were before the Industrial Revolution. How is that going to work? How is that going to help us? It's not. In fact, it will make the environment far worse. It really doesn't make any sense. But let's go on to clip 2, where he does a little bit more explanation when he's on with Stephen Colbert on CBS.
You last night in the town hall on climate change, you called climate change a sin.
Yeah.
In what way is climate change a transgression of God's laws?
Well, look, I'm not out to impose my faith on anybody else, but
Sharia law, is this your Sharia law?
Look, I'm Episcopalian. And
you don't have Sharia law.
Our Sharia law is called the Book of Common Prayer.
Gotcha. Okay.
And there's a lot of stuff in there about the environment. There's a lot of stuff about stewardship for creation. But also, to me, environmental stewardship isn't just about taking care of the planet. It's taking care of our neighbor. We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. And the biggest problem with climate change isn't just that it's going to hurt the planet. I mean, in some way, shape, or form, the planet's still going to be here. It's that we are hurting people. People who are alive right now and people who will be born in the future. The way I see it, I don't imagine that God's going to let us off the hook for abusing future generations any more than you would be off the hook for harming somebody right next to you. And with climate change, we're doing both.
Well,
all right, so a few things with looking at that clip. First of all, keep in mind, I've been doing this for a very long time. I've been a Bible teacher and a preacher for a little over a decade now. I guess about 15 years now, actually. Let me see if I'm understanding Buttigieg's Christianity correctly, his understanding of Christian theologically. He's saying that burgers and straws, if you're looking at it in the context of the clip that we just saw from him, eating a hamburger and using a plastic straw, that is sin. Having gay sex with a man, not a sin. What kind of alternate universe is this guy living in that his understanding of what Christian theology looks like is, all right, you can't eat a burger or you can't drink out of a plastic straw because it might hurt the planet, and if you do that, you're part of the problem, but I can have sex with a guy as much as I want to, and God's perfectly okay with that. He ain't getting that from the Bible. I don't know where he's getting it, but it certainly is not from God. And when you understand exactly what he's trying to push here, it's very clear, and we've talked about this in several other segments about Buttigieg before, that basically his Christian theology comes from, well, I can make God say whatever I want him to say. I know better than God. We've done segments on that in the past where he basically flat out explains, well, God basically does whatever I want him to do. You see, what has happened is that Pete Buttigieg has made himself God, because now that he is the one that can say what God says and what God means, and he's the ultimate authority on what God thinks is okay and not okay, well, then he's made himself God, and whatever he personally dislikes, that is sin, and whatever he does not dislike or whatever he enjoys, that is not sin. That's how he completely undoes the Christian theology in his mind. You see, the whole point of the scripture is that God makes us in his image, and we do the best that we can, Romans 12, to conform ourselves to the image of God, to get back to that state of being close to God by trying to conform ourselves to the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. Buttigieg does the opposite. He's saying, I remake God in my image, and I make God what I want him to be. That's the only way you can get to something that God flat out in the scripture calls an abomination against him, an abomination against creation, you can step right over that one and somehow land at, but using plastic straws and eating beef, that's a sin. It's kind of like you'll just step way over a very obvious sin and say, nope, not going to deal with that, and then stretch out. I mean, if there was ever an example of straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel, that's it. Which, by the way, is the whole point of that parable. That phrase, straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel, comes from the Bible, and what was Jesus talking about? What he was talking about is, you Pharisees are very good at calling people sinners when they take one too many steps on the Sabbath, which is a law that they just made up in their own head, much like Buttigeig with the straws and the beef. So you just made up an arbitrary rule in your head and said God wouldn't be okay with this, therefore if you engage in it, you are sinning. And you'll go around the world to ignore the fact that you guys have completely left your duty to take care of your parents, which is one of the 10 Commandments. So if we're talking about the law of Moses here, you have gone around the world to get to something that God never said was a sin, is sinful, while completely ignoring one of the top 10 that Moses gave you. This is a perfect example of that. Pete Buttigieg is doing exactly what Jesus condemned the Pharisees for at the time. And I will say that the one somewhat true, because all good lies are based on a kernel of truth. This is even true when Satan lies to Christ or in other occasions, that every good lie, or at least effective lie, I won't say good lie, that implies moral goodness. Every effective lie is based on some kernel of truth. The kernel of truth in that argument is that we are commanded by God to be good stewards. That is a part of God's design for mankind. What's the first job that Adam had in the garden? Before he had a wife, before he had that responsibility as a husband, which ironically has a lot to do with why Buttigieg's lifestyle is wrong, but let's not get into that now. Let's focus on this. The first job that Adam had was to keep and dress the garden. God made a creation, and he charged man with taking care of it. Now, God does his part, which is a much bigger part of taking care of it as well, but man does play a role in ensuring that God's creation that God has blessed us with is maintained properly. That is a moral, biblical truth. But here's the problem with what Buttigieg is saying. It is inconsistent with his overall policy proposal. Because if you're looking at the message from creation, a hierarchy is made. Because if you're looking at the world as God created it, there was a hierarchical system there when it comes to creation. Whether you're looking at what he created and when, he created dry land, and then he created birds and fish, and then he creates plants, and then birds, and then fish, and then he creates land animals, and then mankind. See, mankind is the zenith. It is the pinnacle of God's creation. It's the only part of creation that was made in his image. Did God create everything else? Absolutely. Is it good? Yes, we see that from Genesis. God looked on it and said it is very good. And does mankind have a responsibility to try to preserve God's creation to the best of his ability? Absolutely. But man is still at the top. Man is still the most important. And so because of that, you understand that the creation was made for man, not man for the creation. God didn't have to have human beings to maintain his creation. He can do that on his own. He wants us to maintain his creation. That's part of our charge. But that's not what it was created for. Creation, the world, animals, trees, they were created for us. We weren't created for them. They were created to maintain us and see to our well-being, not the other way around. And so, yes, we're supposed to be good stewards of our land and every other blessing. I believe in that very strongly. But the problem with this is that you're doing The opposite, and again, I go back to the teachings of Christ. This is where they're trying to implement things that are not part of God's law. It's like putting new wine into the old wineskin, or putting a new patch of clothing on the old. It doesn't fit. It doesn't mesh. You see, because you're saying, well, the Sabbath, man was made for the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. They were trying to take the Sabbath, trying to take man and fit it into the Sabbath, when he's saying, no, the Sabbath was made for the benefit of mankind. And in the same way, the earth, creation, plants, animals, the resources that God gave us to survive, those are things that were made for the benefit of man. And so, yes, we're supposed to preserve it and keep it and take care of it as much as humanly possible, but we're never supposed to forget that ultimately these resources are here for the benefit of humans. And so if we had to take humans and put them in an unfavorable position to benefit the earth, then that's doing the opposite of what God always intended. That is going against the hierarchical system that God has put into place. And so when that happens, we have to remember that we're supposed to use these resources. God actually commands us to use these resources to make things. He has given us these things for our benefit. And that's the reason that he gives us the means to make houses and food and clothing. And all of these things are talked about in the scripture. So yes, we expend resources. And yes, we're supposed to be careful with those resources and how we use them. But we're never supposed to allow humans to devolve into misery, which would happen if we deindustrialize America and other first world countries. We're never supposed to say, vast human misery, that's fine as long as the planet's okay. That's not the way that it's supposed to go. And when you're looking at people in the third world that are having a hard time buying food, that have to, I was looking at something that Steven Crowder put out a long time ago about the environment. People that only turn on the electricity enough to heat up a can of beans because that's all they can afford because of how high their electric bills are. You're telling me that you're willing to do that? You're willing to inconvenience humans to that level, even sometimes to the point of starvation, because you want to preserve the planet? You're looking at the world in the opposite way that God always intended. And speaking of that, you talk about, well, we're supposed to love our neighbor in that clip. That's what Buttigeig was saying. We're supposed to love our neighbor. We're supposed to take care of them. And that's why we need to invoke these climate change policies. We're supposed to worry about future generations. How is bankrupting future generations supposed to help them? If anything, if we're concerned about the future, we need to drastically scale back government spending, not accelerate it. Even the inexpensive, the cheaper plan that Bernie rolled out with the Green New Deal was $16 trillion over 10 years, which would necessarily increase our taxes by at minimum 34%, just to keep on pace, not even to start paying the debt down. That's just to keep us at the debt levels that we are now. And somehow that's compassionate? To say that 34% more of everybody's money has to go towards this? Bankrupting the country is not a compassionate thing to do. If you're worried about the future, the Green New Deal stuff it should be the thing that we stay the furthest from. So let's go ahead and look at this next clip by Bernie Sanders, which kind of plays right into this.
Let's take another question from our audience. Martha Redioff is a teacher from New Milford, Connecticut. Martha, welcome.
Good evening. Human population growth has more than doubled in the past 50 years. The planet cannot sustain this growth. I realize this is a poisonous topic for politicians, but it's crucial to face. Empowering women and educating everyone on the need to curb population growth seems a reasonable campaign to enact. Would you be courageous enough to discuss this issue and make it a key feature of a plan to address climate catastrophe?
Well, Martha, the answer is yes. And the answer has everything to do with the fact that women in the United States of America, by the way, have a right to control their own bodies and make reproductive decisions. And the Mexico City Agreement, which denies American aid to those organizations around the world that allow women to have abortions or even get involved in birth control, to me is totally absurd. So I think, especially in poor countries around the world, where women do not necessarily want to have large numbers of babies, and where they can have the opportunity through birth control to control the number of kids they have, something I very, very strongly support.
I want to...
All right, so first of all, I would like to congratulate CNN on getting John Lennon to ask that question. Where did they find her? She does look like John Lennon. I don't know. Anyway, without the facial hair, of course. But Bernie Sanders just buys wholesale into this. And actually, looks almost like Janet Joplin. Anyway, I'm sorry, I'll get off that. Apparently, Bernie Sanders' plan to save the world is the same plan that Thanos had to save the universe. If we just wipe out half the population, if we just snap them right out of existence, then we're going to be fine. Which, granted, Bernie is not quite as the imposing physical specimen that Thanos is, but he does sit in a chair an awful lot, so maybe there is a connection there. I don't know. Evidently, that seems to be Bernie's plan. But the reason this is such a load of garbage, Malthusian economics, which is what this is essentially based on, was disproven in the 1700s. So for those of you who don't know, the first person that came up with this maximum population, that eventually the population would be too great, it would be too great a load for the Earth to sustain based on the resources that we have, was a guy named Thomas Malthus. And he came up with this theory that I believe it was by the year 1790, the population would exceed where the resources would be able to actually keep up with them. But the thing that he didn't count on is human ingenuity. Because by the numbers, Malthus was right. But he did not factor in mankind's ability to adapt to a new environment or a new challenge, and to be able to overcome it through technology. And so for, 300 years now, closer to 200 years actually, but for at the very least 240 years now, we have been living in a time that disproves everything that Malthus believed in. That eventually there were not going to be enough resources to sustain the level of population that we have. And right now, the reason that this is so crazy, we are actually living at below replacement levels. The United States birth rate is slightly below 2, and since it takes 2 to tango, you don't exactly have to be a math expert to realize that our population is on par to shrink, not increase. Because we're replacing ourselves at about 1.9, which means that we're not getting over that 2 mark. So our population, at least the population in America, isn't growing. And what's amazing to me is Bernie Sanders, for all the talk about Donald Trump being a Nazi, Bernie Sanders just made a Nazi argument. I'm not saying that Bernie Sanders is a Nazi, don't take me out of context. But I'm saying this is the same argument that the Nazis used for why they had to get rid of certain parts of the population. Because it started with disabled people and old people. And then later on, as time progressed, it moved to other groups like Jews, like capitalists, like the gypsies, so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through every one of them because I think there's about, 13 or 14 groups. But anyway, that expanded because they said, we just don't have enough resources. We can't possibly do this. Humankind, when the population grows, that means there is a larger pool of ideas and more people that are willing to work on problems to solve those issues of resource shortages. If anything, we should be doing the best that we can to increase the population because we've been doing it since the 1790s and it's worked out pretty darn good. Look where humankind was then and look at where we are here. We were pooping outside and reading by candlelight. Now we're living in the world that we are now, despite the fact that economists back then were saying the sky is falling and Earth is going to see a massive extinction level event in starvation because we will not be able to sustain it. That was disproven more than 100 years ago. And what's amazing to me is this woman asking the question is a teacher who apparently is in charge of teaching children this and still believes this disproven theory. That ought to scare the pants off of people. And it's a glowing testament to why the public school system is not what it once was. But he's making that same argument that the Nazis did. That, well, we've just got to kill people. We've got too many people. We don't have enough resources. Let's just kill them. And then there won't be the people. And what he's specifically doing when he's talking about people in South America, Central America, he's talking about doing it to poor people. That's what's so astounding here. I guess his logic is basically, well, if we kill the poor people, there will be no income inequality because we will have no poor people. They will be dead. That's essentially what Bernie Sanders is saying. You just kill off the poor people, and then you don't have poor people to worry about. Now, that never works because, again, the Nazis actually tried it. They said that, oh, well, these interlopers in our country, the gypsies, the Roma, the Jews, everybody else, they're a drain on society because they're using up all of our resources that rightfully belong to us. So what we've got to do is we've got to kill them off so that they're not using those resources anymore. And it didn't work. In fact, Nazi Germany was starving by the time that the Americans broke through in the Battle of the Bulge. Their resources were abysmal. I've talked to people that lived through that time in Germany. And we're talking about how they would literally have gangs of kids roaming around the streets of Berlin, rooting through trash to find something to eat because they only got half a loaf of bread every day. Killing off massive portions of their population to try to sustain it and try to save all the resources for themselves was an abysmal disaster. And the same thing will happen if we implement Bernie's plan. You can call it abortion if you want to, but it's still a genocide and it's still specifically targeting the poorest people. And this is Bernie's brilliant new strategy that's never been tried before. You've got to give me a break here. All right, so I have run out of time and I've actually got to go help the Montgomery Biscuits. They're going to be playing tonight on Sports Radio 740. News Radio 1440 has the Braves game. Sports Radio 740, so I will be doing that, and hey, they're tied up at 1-1. They got to beat the Jackson Generals, and we may wind up going on to a championship. So I will be doing that, be behind the board. So be sure to listen to that tonight on Sports Radio 740, our sister station. Until then, stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.